Let's start with that project. What are some of the questions and what are some of the things that are bouncing back as you explore religion and religiosity at this moment?
Well, one thing that was kind of exciting, but also somewhat dispiriting to realize that we had started this research project before COVID. As anyone who's ever done this kind of data thing, it takes months to get the time with the respondents and with NORC. And so we've been working on it for a long time and we've changed gears quickly. But the theme we had planned to go in with was on religious freedom and the question of the status of religious freedom as a concept for Americans. We really wanted to look especially questions of vaccine in the wake of the bake shop case. We wanted to go check in with Americans on what they thought about religious freedom. And what was so interesting from that data, and then we quickly drafted a new survey about COVID, was what a small minority of Americans agree with this small minority of protesters who think it's a threat to their religious freedom for us to be needing to practice social distancing and quarantine as it relates to congregational practice. A tiny number. And this is a survey across political spectrum, equal parts left and right, across the denominational spectrum and theological spectrum. So it's just always striking to be reminded what an outsized presence extreme voices have in our media. But if you proportionally actually covered these protests about religious freedom that have been happening in courthouses, which are also obviously also protests about economic involvement, certain dissent from the very fact that we're being socially controlled at all by the imagined left media. But if you made that proportional, that's something like 1 in 1,000 people thinks that that's a right view. And yet if you watch the media, you think this is an incredibly loud portion of Americans. So one thing that's disturbing, and that they strongly feel that religious freedom is a value that you weigh out with other kinds of freedom and is quite like and equitable with the concept of public health. So for example, we found that the same small portion of Americans think that the right not to vaccine as a parent should be seen as a religious freedom. Indeed, most Americans, a vast majority, much stronger across evangelical to left Christians, Jews, Muslims, all think vaccination is a public health right, and therefore should not be seen as an exempted quality under religious freedom law.
Before we get to the 199 out of 1,000, let's focus on the 1 out of 1,000 for a minute. In religious and philosophical terms, how do you understand those folks who seem to be willing to put themselves at risk for what they believe? How do you understand who those people are who are out on the courthouse steps in Michigan or well now, I mean, really all over the country?
What I would love to do to expand the survey would be to find out if the thing I'm about to say is sociologically accurate, but I'm going to wager, just as a cultural studies person, that it might be accurate, that I have a couple brilliant doctoral students working on the kind of falsity of wellness culture, the way that wellness culture has entered a religious discourse. A student, Cody Musselman, looking particularly at fitness regimes and how they have become so predominant in the spiritual identity of Americans. And with that, she's really diagnosed all this incredible journalism that's gone on debunking things like the Goop Project, in which there's a lot of, by certain scientific measures, false claims about the body. Mm-hmm. So call it a left form of scientific dissent, so that they say regular medicine has been sexist and abused women's bodies, so we're going to follow the celebrity whose recommendations might produce her embodiment. I'm here you see drawing a pair, because if we think only in terms of a kind of radical right politics, I think we miss the ways in which a disbelief in science does cross the spectrum.
Yes.
And which holding that down always has economic ends and a political critique, so that the critique is what holds in common Gwyneth Paltrow with right protesters in Ohio is a sense establishment medicine is pretty messed up, which it turns out a lot of people in between agree, since we see such a strong number of people saying now we should have a different kind of medical healthcare system and a way to finance it. So that the common sense is something's not treating me well specifically, but then how fervently you take that, how outside the system you want to be, I think depends on one's own social proclivities and capacity to survive the stigma attached with being such a radical. I'm deep in the Hilary Mantel series about Tudor England right now, and that's of course the time in which Protestants were burned for being Protestant. And history, a lot of Protestants in America would say those are the bravest people in the world. But if you're deep in the Mantel novels, which are done through the voice of this very secular rationalist Thomas Cromwell, they seem like these protesters in Ohio. They seem like madmen, or like Gwyneth Paltrow.